So far, some 28 million people have died of the disease worldwide. And across the globe today, some 40 million men, women, and children are living with HIV/AIDS. And every year, 3 million more become infected, and some 2.5 million die of the disease. And right here in the United States, 56,000 Americans will become infected with HIV this year. And AIDS is the #1 killer of African American women between the ages of 25 and 34. Now, until recently, the vast majority of people living with HIV had no hope of access to treatment because the pharmaceutical industry, most Western governments, and the World Trade Organization have all rapaciously pursued patent protection for life-saving pharmaceuticals, even in the face of pandemics like AIDS. Now, how do you have hope in the face of an epidemic like AIDS? How do you see possibility when charity and pity are simply not good enough? Well, at that clinic in South Africa, Doctors Without Borders, in a public act of civil disobedience, was about to begin treatment by publicly and illegally importing AIDS drugs into South Africa. In 1999, as then president of MSF, I had the privilege of launching MSF's Access to Essential Medicines campaign, and it was a challenge to a failing politics. We mobilized a coalition of citizens groups from around the world, and we publicly shamed the pharmaceutical companies and governments that supported the privilege of profit over people's right to exist. We pooled our purchasing power and bought generic versions of AIDS drugs. And we brought the price of treatment down from over $15,000 US dollars for patented versions of antiretrovirals to less than $200 for generic versions of exactly the same drugs. And from Seattle to Washington to WTO meetings in Doha, we challenged, we pushed, and we cajoled the pharmaceutical industry, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and national governments around the world. In 2001, the coalition successfully challenged 39 pharmaceutical companies in South Africa who were trying to block the government's legitimate right to import generic medicines to treat AIDS in their country. And again in 2001, the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria was created partially, and if not largely, in response to direct pressure from this global coalition. The coalition has pushed the WHO to launch a commission on innovation, on public health, and on intellectual property rights. And it's also cajoled the WHO to assume its responsibility in actively pursuing people's right to health. For example, the establishment of its 3x5 program, which now has more than 3 million people on antiretrovirals in the developing world. Now, none of these outcomes have been perfect. And some, like the World Trade Organization Doha Declaration, are far from perfect. But politically, and some of these are politically rhetorical successes, and some are, while a rhetorical success, a practical failure. But the campaign does demonstrate that however imperfectly, change, just change, is possible. And most importantly, people who are going to die a terrible death now have at least a hope in hell that they can live with HIV and other neglected diseases in the developing world. Now, the campaign was a very practical initiative. It is, as I have stressed, imperfect and will not itself solve the crisis in access to essential medicines. But it is a start. By taking on one practical problem, access to antiretrovirals, to antimalarials, or the lack of research and development for Chagas disease or leishmaniasis. The campaign demonstrates that alternatives are possible, that there exists a world of possibility if we choose to see it and if we choose to create it. And we did this in the way that social movements have done for centuries. The women's rights movement, the labor rights movement, the movement against slavery, the environmental movement, and others all have begun in a refusal to accept the unacceptable. And they point to what are fundamentally political choices about human dignity and about equity. And they challenge core assumptions and provoke a particular framing of the political choice. In all cases, however, While civil society demands are, in most cases, legitimate, they remain informally legitimate. The final choice is political, and only states can make formally legitimate political choices. Now, I've talked about the crisis in access to essential medicines, and let me turn very briefly before I close to a vastly underestimated climate crisis that is changing our planet in ominous ways. The Canadian Medical Association has only a few weeks ago released a report saying that 21,000 people die every year in Canada because of the health effects of smog and climate change. Globally, the World Health Organization says that climate change is already causing 150,000 deaths a year from heat waves and respiratory illnesses. West Nile virus, never seen in North America before the year 2000, has infected more than 21,000 and killed more than 800 Canadians and Americans in the last 8 years. The Canadian government has warned that the country might eventually experience yellow fever and malaria. And Lyme disease has moved north up through the United States, and dengue fever is following. These are a direct consequence of climate change. And globally, not only will the number of severely naturally unnatural droughts and floods and hurricanes increase, but as climate change worsens, wars over water and arable land will also worsen. The slow-motion genocide in Darfur started in early 2003 when ethnic African Arab rebels took up arms against Sudan's Arab-dominated government. The rebels say that the government is oppressing black Africans in favor of Arabs amid tensions over water, amid tensions over land, amid tensions over grazing rights between the groups. A UN Environmental Program report says that drought, quote, water shortages and drops in crop yields and the resultant political crisis in Darfur is just an early warning of things to come elsewhere in the world, and especially throughout the Middle East and North Africa, as people fight for limited water supplies. In Africa, within 12 short years, increased water stress will affect between 75 and 250 million people. And crop yields are expected to fall by 50% in some parts of the continent. And the same story is true in some regions of Central Asia and South America. And no amount of humanitarian assistance will be enough in such circumstances. Now, the local and global challenges that I've touched on are formidable. And preparing for this talk, I spoke last week with Earl Pike, who told me about a colleague who had seen about 200 people die of AIDS over his career. The colleague told Earl, quote, that my heart is broken again and again. And Earl asked me that with all that I have seen, what is the wisdom of a broken heart? What does it take to dream again? Well, the answer for me lies not in optimism, but in hope. And for me, hope is born in a humility that sees, as the great 19th century poet Gerard Manley Hopkins said, that sees the dearest, dearest freshness deep down things. Now, hope is not the same as optimism. And while I'm sometimes optimistic, in fact, I am always hopeful. Optimism is the expectation, based on the evidence at hand, that there is a reasonable chance of a good outcome. Hope, on the other hand, is the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how a situation might turn out. Now, this distinction between hope and optimism is not mine. It's Václav Havel's, who, as you well know, was a tireless opponent of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia and became the first president of the newly democratic state when that regime fell. And Havel didn't write these words as a victorious reflection, but from prison, a grim, solitary confinement